Welcome to SEN Insights, powered by Rubrik. I'm Paul Clayton, CEO of SEN and your host today. In each episode, we connect with sector leaders and practitioners to discuss the challenges, opportunities, and ideas shaping student experience. Let's get into today's conversation. Hello, and welcome back to SEN Insights, powered by Rubrik, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of student experience, tertiary leadership, and everything it takes to build vibrant campus communities. I'm your host today, Paul Clayton, and today we're stepping back from the daily firefighting to look at the bigger picture. We're asking a fundamental question: what creates communities where people genuinely thrive? It doesn't matter if you're running a student association, residential college, leading volunteers, steering a university department. We all want to know the secret ingredients that make communities successful, connected, and resilient. Today, we've got Kim Copeland, who is a renowned expert in community engagement, culture, and leadership development, with an incredible wealth of experience across the university, government, and community sectors. Joining her today is our fantastic colleague, Gemma Edgar, who brings deep insights into how organizational structures, boundaries, and human connection intersect to shape the spaces we live and work in. Kim, Gemma, a warm welcome today to SEN Insights. Thank you very much for joining us. Okay, well, thanks very much indeed for joining us today, ladies. Just so setting the scene, because obviously a number of our members have engaged with you guys on around the respect and the gender-based violence issue, but we're doing something a little bit different today. So to set the scene for our listeners, when we talk about community where people are genuinely thrive rather than just participate, whether that's a student union, campus residence, corporate workplace, what does that actually look like in practice?
It's a great question. I'm happy to jump in on that because I think we use that term thrive so often, or hear it so often, but I don't know, we spend enough time stopping and thinking about what does thriving look like, because it's more than people turning up, isn't it? It's about understanding why you're there,
100%.
what you're contributing to, being part of it. It's huge.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
I would say it's about people really being able to be authentically themselves and feel safety in doing that. And thinking about how do we intentionally create environments or conditions where people can express who they are and feel seen and valued, and most importantly, feel really heard in the community that they're trying to join.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's, I can only speak for myself, but I'm at my best when I'm feeling comfortable with those around me.
Absolutely.
And when you're feeling like, oh, do I really fit in here? You've got no chance of giving your best contribution.
And I think most people turn up to a new experience wondering, am I going to fit in here? And I think one of the strongest signals is perhaps seeing those welcoming signals. So possibly seeing people like yourself there is really important. Maybe hearing those key messages that you need to hear in those welcomes or expectation setting. That really creates that safety that people are needing and wanting in those initial moments of, hang on, do I belong here? Is this for me? And I think that is one of the barriers that we can really quickly support people with, in what you were just saying there, Paul, with, people are going to be a little bit unsure. So let's try and give them something to build that comfortability, because most people are feeling uncomfortable when they first show up.
That's right. That's right. And actually, I'll be interested to see how this develops, and we can reflect back on this at the end. But people say to me, "Oh, you're an extrovert. You're great in a crowd." And that, actually, it's part of my job. I don't like it. It's not my natural state of being. I'm quite quiet when I go to a room when it's a bunch of people I don't know. But in this role, there's an expectation. I'm a connector. I talk to people. We catch up with members and that. So that's not my usual go-to. But I definitely recognise that I'm better in an environment where it feels welcoming. So. Superb. Okay, so we've had previous discussions around this. We talked about tackling some common myths about community building. What would you say is the single biggest assumption people in leadership positions get wrong when they're trying to engage a community?
Look, I think the biggest mistake people make is assuming that engaging means giving more information or simply communication, because while that helps, and it does help to create engagement, people want to actually be heard and valued and involved and understand what's happening and be able to make decisions or have opinions and those kinds of things. And I think engagement's often thought about as a communication strategy rather than a relational concept.
Yeah, and I would agree with what Kim's saying. And just adding to that, I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions is that you bring people together and they're therefore just going to connect, and that you've built a community. But I think there's a lot more strategy and vision that is needed to make sure that people, are having a shared experience that is very meaningful, that they're purposely building relationships and having avenues where they can build that connection. And I have a really great example, which I often used to think about, was we often jump into food being the contributor. And Kim and I had a bit of a joke before where we said, how do we come together at Avyon? We eat together a lot.
Yeah.
And if you talk to most people who work in student spaces, they say, we bring students together with food, because I think it's one of those common things that we do.
Definitely.
But we often host barbecues. It's often a quick link to bring people together. So what we often do is we put on a barbecue and 300 people show up, and we say there was 300 people, therefore it was successful. But if we think about, rather than just gathering people and thinking about maybe building communities, it's more intentional, and we're trying to form community by giving people access. So we might think of things like splitting those 300 people into smaller cohorts where there's a peer leader or a returning student, for example, who can have influence and guidance. Thinking about how they might participate in a shared activity together. And I think what happens is, rather than just knowing that you met a group of people, you're actually walking away with saying, and now I know someone's face, I know their name, maybe I know what they're studying. And I've also got a list of a couple of extra events that I might join in the year. And we've broken down that barrier of discomfort, because all of a sudden they've got comfort in knowing people who might be at the next event.
Yeah, great. So what I'm hearing is listening, involvement, but also connection, finding somebody, your people, if you like. Is that right? Would you say that's...
Yeah, I think as humans, we're hardwired to connect. Our survival has,
Yeah, that's right.
We've needed it.
It's in our DNA. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, well, that's good. That's a nice segue then to our next section, where we talk about trust, belonging, and connection. The first core ingredient, trust. Everybody agrees that trust is essential, but it's notoriously hard to build and incredibly easy to lose. I had somebody describe it as a bank account to me once, which works really well in my head. If you work across the university and community sectors, what actually creates trust between community leaders and its members, would you say?
Isn't that a great question? I think trust is something that's at the forefront of most people's minds when they think about the education sector. And I think there's so much change happening, so much is happening all the time, and people want to understand why it's happening. And when we don't understand things, we kind of can feel uncertain and unsafe, and it impacts trust. But if we think about trust, it's about establishing, who are we, what are we here for, what's our purpose, what can you expect that will happen in certain circumstances or processes, and then being predictable and consistent and reliable, but also thinking about humans and the way they experience things. And trust is something we talk about all the time. It's foundational to a trauma-informed approach, which is what guides a lot of our work in safety, trust, and agency being those pillars. But I think trust is often assumed as this thing that kind of comes along as you're doing things. But we've got to consciously build it. We've got to talk about things. We've got to establish that sense of trust. And then we've actually got to walk the talk. And I think that's the bit. It takes some time and effort. So trust doesn't just appear one day. It does take the effort. And I like that idea of the bank account, when we withdraw a bit much. But trust is a bit like that. We spend a lot of time building it up, but it can be gone in a heartbeat.
That's right, really quickly.
I love the bank account analogy. I do a lot of work in restorative practice, and we call it the relational currency. And so what are you putting into that piggy bank? How are you ensuring that you're building relationships? I think relationships are key, and I'll say the relationships word probably 100 times
That's fine,
in the conversation today, because I think they're integral to everything that we do. And you can't have expectations of people or expectations of people where you have trust with each other unless you're actively engaging and building in that relationship. And I think that goes both ways. I think that's not just staff who work within universities or organizations, but also thinking about students. They want to have a relationship with you as well in order to build that trust. So we need to be able to find a way where we are intentionally looking at avenues to build those relationships in a professional way that are really warm, that have kindness, but also hold accountability. I think that also is a great indicator of trust as well. And one of the most important things that Kim and I really talk about is if you say you're going to do something, make sure that you actually do it. Even if you can't do it, communication is such a key element in building trust. And that communication, as Kim said, most people want to know if something is happening, and we have a responsibility to communicate where we can, when it's appropriate, when things are happening, so that people know that we are being as transparent as possible in our roles.
Yeah,
I agree. And I think to build on that, when you think about the communities that SEN members are building, trust actually underpins everything, because it determines whether people will join, whether they'll engage, whether they'll ask questions, whether they'll have new ideas, a whole range of things, even whether they'll try something new. So it is absolutely central to the work of all of your members.
And it's interesting. I had a discussion once with a colleague. I'm going back decades now, but he was saying that trust doesn't necessarily have to be about the highest quality product either, because if you look at McDonald's as an example, people go back to McDonald's sometimes not because they're expecting top quality food, because let's be honest, it's garbage. But
I didn't know where you were going with that.
you can go in any McDonald's anywhere in the world and get the same product. You know what you're going to get. You can trust that actually it's not the greatest, but I'll get a Big Mac and fries and a Coke, and you can go in there. Whereas if you go somewhere new, you don't know what you're going to get. So there's a comfort in that, if you like.
Yeah.
Well, people say that, trust is about being consistent, reliable and dependable. So if you think about McDonald's, it's kind of all of those things. 100%. And you get a smile usually. So the compassion is there too.
Excellent. Yeah.
I don't think Kim ever thought her framework would be likened to McDonald's, but here we are.
No, sorry.
I'm thinking it through.
Kim. Yeah, I won't do that again. There's a beautiful phrase in your outline when we were talking about the pod about belonging and connection. How do we design spaces and programs that kind of fast track that feeling of belonging, especially for people who might initially feel like outsiders, that's a lot of our community, because, a lot of our members find that a lot of the people that they're engaging with are regional students, online students, or the international students, because so many of the domestic students already have their local networks. So the stuff that's going on campus is often people that might initially feel like outsiders.
Such a good question. Gemma, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I think, again, I keep coming back to this word kind of being really intentional, but I always talk to people about this and say, don't overcomplicate it, because I think sometimes we can get too into the thinking around how to bring people together and how to fast track that sense of belonging, as you spoke about. I think most people at the core of it, they just really want to feel seen. They want to feel heard. And I think when we allow people to have that sense of belonging, they feel really valued in the communities that they're starting to engage with. I think one of the greatest ways to establish this in a really quick way is to ask people, is to actually go to them and talk to them about what it is that they would like to see in their experience as part of this community. I think so for most people, they come up with some incredible ideas that you probably or your team haven't thought about yourself. And I think when we think, sometimes I think we can fall into what I used to call as groundhog year, where we start to just do the same thing year in, year out. The calendar looks the same. We put up the same events. And I think for some parts, that is really important, because we want to build ritual and tradition as part of a sense of belonging. But for other things, I think that if you think about bringing people in and really considering the co-design and allowing people to feel part of it from the beginning, you're going to get more buy-in. And I think the next level of that is really the value we place on student leaders and returning students. I think they have a really important role to play in this, because they themselves have already gone through that discomfort of, do I belong? How do I know I'm going to be part of that? And they usually come back with this great sense of energy to ensure that other people have that really positive experience that they once had. So they take the strengths of the year before and think about how they can implement that in a great way for others as well. And I will also say the other thing I often think about is making sure that your student leaders or your teams within your communities, that they reflect the diversity of the community, because I think the strongest signal that people will ever see is that people like me belong here.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Absolutely agree, unsurprisingly. And that's where my mind went straight to as well with this question, Paul, that really people decide whether they belong before they even get there. And I think that's easily forgotten. You know, when I'm deciding, do I want to join a group or an association or a club or sports team or go to an environment, you know, people are looking for clues about whether they're welcome or that visibility and representation. So if we think about culture, we call them the artifacts. What are people seeing that helps? It might not tell them everything, but how do they first decide? And I think we've got much better at that over time. I think representation and visibility is getting better. And I think you said before about decades, you know, we don't like to get into ages and numbers, but it was a long time ago that I first went to university. And when I think about the difference in that visibility, it's really different. So we see things like, if we think about our LGBTQ plus community, we see pride flags, we see rainbow steps, all these amazing things when you go to universities. And I think they matter because I went to university in a very different time where in the state I was in, they were actually debating whether homosexuality should be legal when I was at university. So there were no signs. It was a time where people couldn't be open. There were quite big consequences, socially or other. And so when I see that now on universities, I just think that's such a massive shift that it's easy to take for granted. But imagine what that's like compared to those years ago that we won't mention the number of. So, you know, how do we think about that in terms of representational signs for everybody?
Yes.
I do think that even though it's becoming part of what we do, I'm not sure that everyone is taking the time to think it's not just something we do. There's a real reason for it. And I think it makes a big difference to students.
Absolutely. I mean, what I'm hearing there is definitely student voice focused, you know, find out what the student wants, but also not just student voice, the voices of the students in the community you're trying to build. Because that's something historically I think we've been guilty of in the university spaces, having a set amount of student representatives, maybe not always as representative of the cohort or the cohort you're trying to reach, making decisions, you know, and then wondering why it's fallen flat because it's not doesn't meet the needs of that community. You're right. That's great.
Absolutely right. You can't be what you can't see. It's a very good.
No, that's right. No, what do they say? Nothing about us without us.
Oh, I like that.
I love that expression.
Yeah.
So, okay, moving on then. Agency, participation and boundaries. True engagement usually requires a sense of ownership. How do successful communities balance giving members real agency and participation without the whole structure devolving into absolute chaos? Because, you know, at the end of the day, this all, it takes time, resources, funding, and needs managing.
I love agency. I've jumped in on that one because it's part of what we talk about too, but I also think it's something that's commonly misunderstood. And if it's not done well, it easily becomes chaotic.
Yeah.
Because agency is your right and your ability to decide what you do, what you engage with, the choices you make. But it can only be done within the guidelines or limitations that exist. So we can have those structurally like legislation, regulation, policy. Actually, it also happens in those norms, values, and ways we behave. And so agency is about what you can choose to do, or what you can do within any guidelines that might exist. And that's how you distinguish between a free-for-all, chaotic environment and true voice and choice within the context of where you are.
Yeah, I think it's really important that people feel like they have voice and choice. So just building on what Kim was saying there, but I also think that people, to feel safe, also need parameters to do so. And so I often think about the social discipline window, which is a restorative tool that we refer to. And it really talks about the importance of working with people. And I think about that in terms of, you know, we all think about student events, for example. Most students would love to just go and put on an event and have free reign to do whatever they wanted. And so when we think about that, we think, you know, if they were to go and plan that without very little guidance, initially that might feel really empowering for those students. But what we would see is that, yeah, some events would be created. They might have some safety concerns in them because we haven't put parameters around that. Expectations around the events might vary. So I've seen events go ahead where they're charging some students $200 to attend. And it's thinking about, well, can every student attend that? Is that accessible? And then often what happens is then conflict emerges. So things like, well, why didn't people attend? Or why was there a safety issue there? And then what happens is they actually do then look at staff to then intervene in those situations. And then I think about the other side, which is, well, let's have really high compliance where staff plan every single event, and students, sure, they might attend, but the ownership is very, very low. So the connection, that sense of accountability, or that sense that it's contributing to something bigger is not really there. So I think when we look at that restorative approach within those social disciplines of working with students, I think it's co-designed. And so what happens is you have the students deciding on what are the activities, what are the themes. They might think about the traditions that they do want to uphold that are safe, that they become important because they, as Kim said, they reflect the values and the community that people want to feel a part of, because that's what they've read about, that's what they've seen. And then so I think staff will always have a really key role to play in things like making sure that there are safety parameters in place, that we look at risk assessments, for example, and we support students through them. I think one of the biggest things that we can do is support students with understanding the why we want to put parameters in place. And it often comes to safety. And I think together, when we work with students, it's about what is the kind of community that we want to build together. And it gets away from that you and us, or us and them, because I think that can become really apparent very quickly in communities where there's staff and students. And again, it comes down to that formation of the relationships and working with one another and being with as a team together with the same outcome, which is that most of these students want to have a good time, but do it in a safe way.
100%. Yeah, that's right. I mean, and the next question you've kind of covered a little bit there, but I think there's still a bit more to pick out there about the boundaries typically being seen as restrictive. But how do clear guardrails and accountability actually help a community thrive? What's the risk if you don't have them in place?
I think I'll just jump in, Kim, sorry, because Kim knows this is my favorite thing to talk about. I could talk about boundaries. It's a weird thing to love to talk about, but I think boundaries are so important. And I think people often think boundaries are like this stone wall where you have to be this really harsh person who has really, strong gates that are closed and people have to like really jump over them. But actually, I think when we think about it, boundaries and accountability, if we think about the environments and the conditions that we want to set up, that they create belonging, because they create a community that is firm. Yes, there's going to be rules. They're kind and they're fair. That's how I see boundaries, as being firm, kind and fair. So when we're firm on what is the community that we want to be and see. What does it mean to be part of this community? And I think communities have to have expectations so that people understand what are the parameters or the rules that kind of bind us together to have some sense of safety. And I also think that we're firm when we hold each other accountable, when those things don't, when, harm is caused, for example. When we think about being fair, I think it's knowing that when things do go wrong or when harm is caused, that accountability will be upheld. And I think that's really important, because I think people need to know that there's rules there for a reason, or there's structures in place for a reason. And as community leaders, it's important that you think about, well, what does accountability look like? And for me as a restorative practitioner, I always look for where can repair be within this community, so that people aren't stuck in that if they do something wrong that we fall into blame and shame, that we can actually repair and reintegrate them back into the community, so people see that as being fair. And then kindness, I think that's where we hold space for each other to learn and grow within our community, but where we also celebrate and have joy for when things go well, because usually within communities there's great things that happen, and we can often focus on the negative. So I think it's also carving out space to ensure we celebrate the joy within our communities as well.
Yeah. Great answer, Jim. I think accountability is definitely worth mentioning, because that would be a criticism of some of our student leaders historically, is there's often been criticism of actions taken or behaviours, but very little accountability that falls out of it. So that's something we probably need to work on. The other thing I like about the boundaries thing is, if you set the boundaries right at the beginning, you don't have to go through that trust deficit phase of saying, well, actually, no, we can't do that.
I used to say this all the time. If you just focus on those first 6 to 12 weeks in the beginning of a year, and you really hold your boundaries firm, and you set the expectations, and you match that with the support, because you've got to match it with support to get people there, you will have a great year, because you've set the tone. And when things go wrong, you have to also have people take accountability for that. And accountability is so important. So people know, oh, these guys are serious. They have set this system, or these processes, or these policies, or these structures in place to create safety and harmony within this community. And when there's harm caused, what does accountability look like? And for me, that repair piece is also really important, so that people know there's opportunity to learn and grow within that.
Right. There was one of the senior leadership. I can't remember his role now, so I'm not going to say it because I'll get it wrong. But he always used to avoid saying no when he was talking to student leaders. But he would say, "Is right. Let's talk about how we get to yes," which I just found. I know it's spin
like
to some extent, but it was just such a more positive way of saying, "Let's how can we work together to get to where you want to go," and without saying, "Yeah, we're not there yet," which I quite liked.
I like it, Paul, and it's a great thing to guide a risk assessment too for an event.
Yeah, that's
Let's keep
totally
going
agree.
with a focus on how we're getting to yes, unless we get to a point. There's nothing more that we could do.
When I do risk assessment training, that's exactly how I put it. Risk management is 100% about how do we get to do what we want to do. Because it's to take all the brakes off, if you like. Okay, moving on then. Leadership, culture, and behaviour. Culture is often described as the way we do things around here, and it heavily shapes behaviour. If a leader inherits a culture that is sluggish or disconnected, how do they practically start shifting the needle towards a culture of active thriving?
Wouldn't it be great if there was a very succinct answer with just 2 steps to answer that?
Please, if you can.
I love the idea of culture, and I've been lucky to work in culture change for quite a while and be really immersed in it. And I've learned so much about not starting from, okay, we've got a culture, or I've come into somewhere and we need to address something. You can't just do it on the spot. It actually takes time. And it's a lot of little things over time. But I think, if thinking about your question about a leader who inherits that culture, what can the leader do? It's about thinking first and foremost about your behaviour and your approach, because people are looking at what the leader rewards or tolerates or turns a blind eye to. They notice those things, even if you're not conscious of them. And they also notice, what do you celebrate? So what are you drawing out that's really good? And I think what we know is that there's all these things you can put in place, but if you haven't got a leader who's been very clear about what is it that we're trying to do, or what are our standards, or what is the culture that we're trying to achieve, then you can't do much if you haven't done that. And once you've decided what that is, it's about how do you actually address expanding or building on the things that are supporting the culture. What are you noticing about what's not? And there's lots of models that help us, ways to think. Most of them say is the things that you initially see won't tell you much except what you see, and you can't necessarily understand. So you need to really think about what is it that you're saying, or the policies, or your values, or your mission, or all of those things say you'll do. And then are the way people are thinking, is it matching those assumptions, the beliefs? If you see a disconnect between what it is you want, saying your culture is happening, actually try and get into that invisible layer, driving that. If something's happening that's not quite matched, is it because people aren't clear about it? Is it that there's some other benefit in something continuing? And I think some of the extreme versions of those things are often the best examples. I think it's like hazing behaviour that's hard, where you could look from the outside and say, why would anyone think this is? Often people might not understand the full impact. Seeing it and then reframing it as a tradition. Traditions are great positive things that organisations should be where they're positive. But reframing something as a tradition to make it sound like something, for example, is an assumption you'd have to address public culture. So I think it's about all of those levels. Yeah, I'm currently doing research and it's around prevention of sexual violence in university residential settings. And what I'm really looking at is how does culture or addressing culture form part of our prevention initiative?
Yep.
So how to actually look at what behaviours are being rewarded or those early indicators of risk, what's being tolerated in examples, for example, in environments. So it's something I think that often gets seen as this thing that develops culture or it will come along with us. What we have to do is, as leaders, set what is the culture we want, needs to happen around that, and what's getting in the way to address while not forgetting. There'll be so many things that support the culture. So we don't take a purely punitive approach. We support and we build on the things that are working as well. So to go back to the question, I think leaders need to balance those two things, celebrate what's working and address and understand what's not and see what might be driving that.
Okay, great stuff. Great stuff. Thank you very much for that. You've both worked across vastly different sectors, universities, government, community spaces. What would you say is the one universal truth about leadership and influence that rings true, no matter what kind of organisation you're dealing with?
I think it's that people need to balance that sense of belonging with also that sense of responsibility, and that when you're working with community, we need to be really explicit in being able to understand to people what is expected, because I think that's when we come back to boundaries and we come back to parameters and creating safety. People need to know and they need to have it communicated with them in different modalities around what is expected of them to be part of this community. Often we can make assumptions that people just automatically know that, and then we get quite upset with them when they don't meet those expectations. But we need to think about how is it that we communicate that with people. And we know that things like onboarding and writing policies, whilst they are important and they need to be in place as part of our systems, they often don't translate. So we need to think of ways of how do they translate to the community that we're working with to set those expectations to create that sense of safety. Yep. We also need to talk to people really clearly about our why. I know that for a lot of students, they would say things like, why can't we do hazing, for example? Yeah. And I think it's important that we actually take the time to sit with students, that we get curious and try and understand what's their why. Why do they want to do it? What's their motivation? Because if we can find an understanding and a mutual agreement together, we could probably find a different type of ritual or a different type of tradition that we could bring in that might have the same outcomes and be driven by the same motivations, but no one's sat down and had that conversation yet, for example. And so I think when we think about coming back to your question about being influential, particularly around leadership, they're probably the two biggest things for me, is really thinking about setting clear expectations and really understanding the why behind what are people doing and being really curious around that and being part of that conversation. Yeah. I know Kim will have lots to say on this.
Oh yeah, I love thinking about leadership. And for me, it reflects a lot of the conversation we've already had, particularly around trust. I think if you're going to be a good leader, you have to establish trust. And, people join organisations because of opportunities or reason that they're wanting to be there, but they stay engaged when there's trust. And I've been really lucky through my career to mostly have amazing leaders. Yeah. I've had a couple of not so good, and I think everyone has that where we learn what not to
Absolutely.
do. We learn. When I think about the amazing leaders I've had, what comes to mind is those interactions, the ability to talk about things, to raise risks, to bounce ideas, to say, I don't know, I'd love to talk through something with you. And they're the people who embraced that, who loved it, or would even do the same back with me. We had a relational engagement, and it was about leaders, and the leader I want to be as well, is that you scaffold things and you provide the structure for your team to succeed. That's your job as a leader. It's not to be better or to stand out or to do all of those things. It's actually to shape things and create an environment where your team can do exactly what they're there to do. So I think that's.
And I just want to add on what Kim's saying around trust. I think it's important that trust goes both ways. Like you want to trust your team. You want to show them that I trust you in your skills, your capabilities, your knowledge, the experience that you bring to this team. I trust you in it, and I will have expectations of you, but I will match that with the support that I will give you to be able to do your role. And then that also, you can't just expect trust back. You also need to demonstrate and inspire the people around you with, I will walk the walk and I will talk the talk. I will put those together. Who I say I am is what I am. And I think that is such a huge part of leadership as well. And we don't want to fall short because we haven't also risen to our own expectations of what we expect of others. We also need to demonstrate in our own leadership.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. Bringing it home then, last couple of questions for you. We love practical examples on this show. Can you each share a favourite real-world example of a community initiative you've witnessed or worked on, either way, that got the ingredients exactly right?
Good time thinking about this one. I went big, but I had the real absolute pleasure and privilege of leading a really big team of dedicated staff whose sole purpose was to ensure that 1,800 residents had an incredible experience while they lived on campus. So we looked after, these 8 different colleges across, the breadths of a university. And one of the things that we initially started to see as part of a culture piece was that there was a huge blame, shame, and punishment. If something went wrong or if harm was caused, it went through a very strict misconduct process. Now, I think misconduct processes are vital. I think they're very important, and I think they create the structures in place that if something goes wrong, students know there will be accountability that will be held. And I think that is vital, particularly when we think about trust and safety. What we did together is we thought about, a table concept. If we had a table, what would be the 4 legs that held this table up that we could anchor ourselves in creating a community and a culture where people are young, they're living out of home for the first time, and also they're going to make mistakes. Obviously, if there is risk, that is a different outcome that we'll be thinking about because it is about safety. But for most people, we were thinking about relationships. So we know that if we were to build relationships with people, people would feel connected. We often found that misconduct was actually present when people felt most disconnected. So we focused on connection as being one of those vital ingredients. And then we thought about sense of belonging. How do we create that sense of belonging, particularly through our student leaders, like I spoke about before? They've done this before. They know what it's like to be part of this community. They've enjoyed it. They've had a great experience and they've wanted to come back. So let's use that as our data, as our evidence to go, okay, what worked? What did you like about this? Let's think about how do you create this sense of belonging so that people do feel really valued and, again, connected. And then focusing on safety. So that third ingredient for us, or the third leg on the table, was how do we create safety and make sure that people feel really secure within this community. And that fourth one is the most important one, which is, I think, is accountability. Because accountability isn't just about taking people through a misconduct process and repairing harm. It's also looking at all of those other things. So if you've got relationships positive in place, if you have that sense of belonging, if you've got your student leaders who are driving that, and you have safety, most of the time the community keeps each other accountable. And so they're my 4 kind of, I would say, ingredients that I have seen work in creating a really strong and established community that people can thrive in.
Great. Thanks for that, Gemma. Kim?
Well, my mind goes to a few, but if I think of a slightly different angle to workplace, I'd think of a community group or a club that I saw being developed from the ground up. And It's a really good example because they deliberately designed for things like safety, trust, belonging, agency
Yep.
right from the beginning. And we don't often see that. So the organisers got together and decided not to determine a structure or roles or specific processes prior to
Right.
thinking about what they wanted the experience of someone to be who joined their group. So they spent time mapping it from how would people find out about it? What might make them want to join, or what might stop them or get in the way, or what questions might they have? What do we
Yeah.
want it to be like the first time they arrive, or how would we hear from them if they had ideas, and how would we show them if we'd responded? They just took so much time to do that, and then they mapped the rest around
Yeah.
it. And I think it's not something that's done often, but it was
Okay.
incredibly powerful because they were able then to think about what would that mean for communication, for how we promote it, for how we welcome people, and how we already answer the questions they might have before they even have them. And this connects to so much of what we've talked about today, whether people could see themselves, they'd feel belonging, they felt welcome. And I just think it's a brave thing to do, to say, let's not do roles and let's not sort processes first. Let's think about, what do we want this to feel like? And I just don't think you could do
Yeah,
better
that's a
than that.
very interesting, innovative approach. I like that a lot. The only thing I'd add you both raised the issue of safety, and I think it's very easy for when people think safety to think about safety from harm, safety from risk. But I think also a really important ingredient in this space is the safety to get it wrong. The safety to get it wrong and learn from that without feeling like, oh, I've done something wrong, or I'm on the naughty chair, or whatever that might look like. We absolutely need those boundaries and consequences when things are intentionally breached, if you like. But you also need that safety to the group, so the group knows that yes, we don't have to get it right, we can learn from it.
And I think what we see is that when we put too much when our boundaries are too firm, particularly around safety, actually people will often try to push, or things will go underground, is what I have seen. So they will try to hide things. And so you actually lose that trust between each other. And so that idea, Paul, of creating safety within your community for people to make mistakes, to get it wrong, and know that there might be a conversation that needs to be had, but that conversation is not anchored in being punitive. That conversation is anchored in growing and learning.
Yes.
Because fundamentally
100%.
that's why people attend our institutions, right? Is because they want to learn, they want to grow, and they're at a such important part of their lives where that's what they're investing in themselves in, is to learn. So I think creating those spaces and holding space for people to have those conversations where they can explore, hey, what happened? What have you thought about since? And how are we going to move forward from this are really important.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Jim. Okay, to wrap us up. A student leader or a sector professional is listening to this today and wants to improve the health of their community tomorrow. What's the first step they should take? Who wants to take that first?
Mine's really quick and really simple.
Go.
Relationships. I think that if you can work relationally and that you can invest in the relationships around you genuinely and authentically with care, the rest will follow. I truly believe that.
Brilliant.
I agree. And I think one of the practical things in terms of a step is to listen, because you can't actually build things like trust or safety or agency well without understanding people. And you should stop asking people to simply engage and start asking, how are they actually experiencing your community or your group or you?
Yeah.
No, great. And listen, I couldn't agree more with both of you. I think of it as the power of coffee. Grab a coffee with someone and just, let them know you're there for them. Find out what's going on in their world, how they're doing at their work, how they're doing personally, all those things. So to build that kind of that personal trust that goes alongside the work trust. So yeah, brilliant. Great stuff. Well, listen, thank you both very much for joining us today. That's excellent. Can't thank you enough. I know a lot of our guys are already engaged with you guys, either directly or through some of the training programs you're providing us. But really grateful for you both coming on today and sharing a bit of magic about community and belonging, which is not only important across our sector, but it's also the theme for the conference this year. So that's excellent value. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you. It's been amazing.
Thanks very much. And listeners, if you've enjoyed today, share it with your colleagues, share it with your friends. Let's like and listen again to whatever podcast's coming up next.
Thanks, everyone.